Welcome everybody to this evening's Practice Management Study Club. Today's topic is, are you spending too much on payroll? What are your numbers telling you? It's being presented by Sandy Balajan. And with that, I get to turn it over to our Veronica Brown, Director of Practice Solutions, and Joanne Freeman, Client Experience Manager, both of them handling all of Canada. Take it away, ladies.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica. It is my honor to introduce you to Sandy Balajan. Sandy is a leading authority on how to increase the effectiveness of dental business systems. Sandy is the author of 2 textbooks, The Dental Office Administration and The Canadian Dental Office Administrator. She wrote the first dental practice management certificate program for the University of Toronto. She specializes in dental business planning, staff development, consulting, and continuing education seminars. Sandy, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank Dental Services Group again for this great opportunity to be involved with the Practice Management Study Club. So welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about numbers, a lot of your practice numbers. So are you spending too much on payroll? But that's just one of the numbers that we'll be talking about tonight. So in tonight's webinar, we'll be learning about team accountability for their time and activities. So what are they doing during their downtime? I've included a number of different handouts for this evening, and I'll explain them as we go through. What you should be tracking and why you should be tracking it, why it's important for your success, how to never lose track of your treatment plans, and also to set hourly production goals and to track them, of course, and achieve them. So what are some things that make successful practice? Well, we're going to talk about the key indicators in dentistry. It's very important to keep your eye on the numbers. However, it's also very important to understand what those numbers mean, and most importantly, how to make real-time corrections in those numbers. So how to make the numbers change quickly, not just wait until the end of the year and make corrections then. It's much too late. So know what your numbers mean and then make your adjustments very quickly. So some of the key performance indicators in dentistry, certainly what I look at when I go to a dental office, is the overhead expenses. The expenses versus the production should be anywhere between 50 to 60% of the overall production. If it's higher than 60%, then there are some adjustments that need to be made in the expenses. And of course, the best way to decrease your expenses is to increase revenue. So they go hand in hand, the two of them. Your accounts receivable are extremely important. We're going to talk about those as well. And they should be at $0 over 90-day for 90-day accounts. So that's a really important thing to remember, because if your patient hasn't paid you in 3 months, chances are that they're not going to be paying you at all. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. Your staff costs should be anywhere between 20 to 25%. Rarely have I seen staff costs at the 20% mark. However, it has been achieved at some offices that I've worked with, but definitely not over 25%. If they're over 25%, then there are some inefficiencies that are happening in your practice, and I can guarantee you that the biggest inefficiency is in the schedule. So that's an important metric to remember. Your lab costs, if you're using outside laboratories, even if you're using like CEREC machines or whatever, then you should be invoicing your patients. So that should be running at about 10%. If it's higher than that, then that's the one metric that can be okay if it's higher. That just means that you're doing higher end dentistry. If it's lower than that, it means that you are providing the bread and butter services of dentistry, but not necessarily doing the higher end like dental implants, crown and bridge, and so on and so forth. Your dental sundry supplies should be 5% of your collections, and I'm going to explain and I'm going to show you how to track that. It's very important, number one, that your staff members understand what sundry supplies are. Those are consumables that are used up in the day-to-day operations of running a dental practice. So it's things like your resins, gauze, things like that are used up in the treatment. Your repairs and maintenance, this is of your equipment. not of your building. So it's your dental equipment. They should be 1% or less. If they're above that, what you need to look at are things like, how's your equipment being handled? I've been in a number of different offices where very expensive hand pieces have been thrown out inadvertently, and certainly by accident, not intentionally, but that can lead to some very costly repairs and maintenance. So it's important to watch that metric, even though it's a low metric, but it should stay low. If it gets higher, then a number of things that you have to think about. One is, does some of your equipment need replacing? And if so, then you need to look at capital planning for replacing the large items like chairs and things like that. Your advertising promotion really depends on the age of your practice. But in general, it usually runs between 2 to 5% of your total production. Newer practices, of course, the advertising and promotion will be huge. The number there will be huge. But it's very important to really target where you are spending your advertising dollars. And print advertising is really not the way to go anymore. I would suggest that you spend a lot of money on a really good website, excuse me, with search engine optimization, and make sure that your website is very effective and it's efficient and it's user-friendly for your patients to go in and to schedule appointments. So that's really where you need to focus your attention. And things like social media. Social media is extremely important. That's where your new patients are coming from nowadays. Your hygiene billings should be at $180 minimum. That's the industry standard per booked hour. Now what that means is you exclude the downtime. So I'll show you how we're tracking that as well. But if your hygienists are billing below $180 per booked hour, then it's important to look at a couple of different things. What is their downtime? What are they doing? And also, what are they billing during their billing hours, their billable hours? So those are things that need to be looked at. So it's important to understand the numbers. Accounting systems and financial statements are certainly beneficial, but generally you get your accounting statements once per year when you do your year end, but they're not worth much if you don't understand what the numbers mean. I would suggest, if you have a really good office manager, I hope there's some office managers on the line tonight, every once in a while you pull a profit and loss statement. So monthly would be great. I'm not sure that your accountant or bookkeeper would appreciate pulling it once a month, but even once per quarter at the very minimum, because there are some numbers that you cannot get from your management systems. One, for example, is staff and payroll costs, and that's something that we're talking about in a little bit more detail tonight. So your profit and loss statement is very important. Sometimes it's called an income statement. If your accountant or bookkeeper is using any kind of electronic accounting system, like QuickBooks, for example, or Simply Accounting, something like that, it's very, very easy to run that report. It's very simple. And it will show you the numbers that we just talked about. In addition to, I'm going to be showing you a tracking system that will show you the other numbers that you can extract directly from your management software. So numbers by themselves really don't mean anything, but numbers with context and meaning are the benchmarks for your success. So your manager really, when they pull these numbers, it's very important that they know what to do with them. They know how to understand them and what activities that need to be implemented immediately in order to make those numbers change. So what's most important for your practice for growth and sustainability? Of course, new patients, acquiring new patients to the practice. Nowadays, that's increasingly difficult because there's so much competition. There are offices that are opening as we speak. There's like practically one on every corner. And just to give you an example, in the area that I live in Burlington, Ontario, and within 2 kilometers, there are 13 dental offices. And guess what? I live in a condo building, condominium building, and there are 2 dental offices right downstairs. So, you know, acquiring new patients and attracting new patients to your practice is increasingly difficult. So it's very, very important that you have excellent customer service, that you do something outstanding for your patients, that they wouldn't necessarily get at other offices. And also that website, as I mentioned, and your search engine optimization is really, really important. I know that a lot of doctors are depending on Google Ads, and I will tell you that, you know, I'm not 100% sure that that they just give you statistics to make you think that these expensive ads are working. I would talk to a really good website designer and just, you know, have them advise you and do some social media advertising as well. Having full and productive schedules is extremely important, and it's not enough just to have a full schedule. That schedule has to be filled with productive appointments. For example, in one of our past seminars, we talked about effective appointment scheduling and scheduling for profitability as well. And that includes having block scheduling. So you're doing high-end procedures, for example, on certain days or maybe in the morning, and then doing other not lower appointments, but doing other appointments like the drill, fill, and bill, for example, in the afternoon, the bread and butter services. Making sure that you're collecting the money that you receive, that's extremely important, because it doesn't matter how much you bill if you're not collecting the money. So, or if your staff isn't collecting the money. So collections is a huge part that increases your practice value. And that's what most practice valuations are depending on, or what your collections are, and the consistency of those collections as well. Your production per hour is extremely important. We're going to be talking about that, especially when it comes to tracking your hygiene production per hour, your doctor's production per hour, and specifically what downtime is involved and what people are doing during their downtime, which is extremely important. And what your payroll costs are. If your payroll costs are too high, then there's inefficiencies somewhere. And I guarantee the very first place to look, as I mentioned, is in the appointment schedule. So tracking systems, your computer's reports don't necessarily track everything. As I said, you might want to, you might need to pull a profit and loss statement as well, once a month if you can, quarterly at the very least. But also these systems don't necessarily track downtime and recovered units. So the tracking systems that we use is a very simple form. I just use an Excel spreadsheet, and I'm going to be showing you one in a moment. But basically what I do is I get the staff to fill in their own tracking sheets, because it's important to not just track the downtime, which no computer system to date has been able to do this. What it doesn't necessarily track is things like, let's say, for example, you had a short notice cancellation and then that was filled by another patient. So that's called a recovered unit, and that's not necessarily tracked. The other thing that isn't necessarily tracked is things like if you're doing ortho, if you have your hygienists who are doing orthodontic, let's say they're doing bands, they're placing bands, or they're doing adjustments, or you're doing adjustments yourself. Those necessarily, because of the nature of ortho, it's paid up front. So those will be units that will be filled, however, they're not productive units. So it's important to exclude those from your tracking system, because it's not fair to have, you could have a whole afternoon of ortho where you're generating, it looks like you're generating nothing, but you have already pre-generated those fees. So it's important to watch those as well. They also don't track the time that is prepaid revenue, which I should have gone on to the next point there. And by that, I mean, for example, ortho. Stats help to provide you with objective data for performance reviews, which is really important as well. So remember, it's very important to remember that when you're doing performance reviews, that you also have to tie it into what your fiscal responsibility is. So your practice has to be doing well, in other words, in order to be able to provide pay increases. And your pay increases should be based on merit of performance anyway. So, but you have to make sure the practice is doing well financially. Performance reviews are based on job descriptions as well as performance agreements as well. So what we use here at Docs is the clinical dashboard report. Basically, it's a practice at a glance report. I usually train office managers to do this once a month, and based on the practice management reports that you produce during your month-end process. And this involves the tracking systems as well. So I'm just going to briefly walk you through this, and we're going to be referring to this dashboard report a few times tonight, but I just want to basically show you the brief outline of what it involves. So we would have the total production per doctor. Each of the doctors are listed here. Below that are all of the hygienists. In this particular case, they have 5 hygienists. And these two numbers, the total of the doctor's production plus the hygienist production, should equal what the total production is that is showing on your practice management report. Then you would have to determine manually how many days each provider worked, and then what their daily production was. Now that is a calculable figure, and this spreadsheet, once again, is a very simple Excel spreadsheet. I like to keep things simple, and those formulas are built in. I've already built those formulas in. So basically it is the total production divided by the number of days worked equals what their daily production is. Very, very simple. How many available hours that each of the providers had, which is really important. You have to know how many hours were available. And then from those available hours, how many were downtime units? So the true downtime would be the downtime that's pretty much left at the end of the day. So because once again, especially with the doctors, you may have an opening, but that gets filled very quickly. Same with the hygienists, as long as there are specific activities that are occurring. And I'm going to be spending some time a little bit later on talking about what the downtime hours and how they translate to the overall production and what management decisions you have to make at that point. So the downtime units would translate then into downtime hours. Once again, this formula is built in, and it's based on whether or not you're working with 10-minute time units or 15-minute time units. Then it would simply divide the units by 4 or by 6, depending on what it is. And that'll give you your hourly billings. So it's very, very simple. The number of recalls seen, you may or may not want to use this for the doctors. But it's a really good idea if you have associates working at your practice, because associates in most cases are paid a flat rate for the number of recall exams that they do. So it's important to track that. It helps you with your associate payroll at the end of the month as well. How many short notice cancellations? And I'm sorry, this isn't quite synced. These columns aren't quite synced properly, but the number of short notice cancellations have occurred and in what provider's column that they've occurred in. How many people have simply not shown up for appointments? So then you know what strategies to use with that, and that is following up with them quickly and that sort of thing. The number of new patients, and I usually break this down per provider as well. It's not as important with the hygiene because the fact is that the patients that come to your practice, they may be referred by a hygienist, but they in fact come to see the doctor. So they are new patients of the doctor, not necessarily the hygienist. But it's important to track that because if you're trying to build your associate practice, for example, within the principal owner practice, then you want to know how many new patients are coming to your practice. And also, if you have, I apologize for my voice today. I've had a little bit of some health issues lately. So I do apologize. I'll try my best here. So the number of new patients is important too if you have multiple associates to make sure that they're getting an even split of new patients in the practice. And then something that's very important to track is the number of inactive patients. How many patients have left your practice either due to moving or hopefully not passing away, but that could definitely be the case. Then it's very important to judge that. Excuse me. You certainly don't want to lose patients to your competition, or you don't want to lose patients because they're leaving your practice because they're not happy for some reason. So that's basically an overview, and then we also look at the total collections. So your total collection should always be at minimum 100% of what you're billing that month. The number of write-offs is really important to watch as well. Now, the reason for that is because if the write-offs are too high, then you have to find out why things are being written off, because this affects your doctor's taxes. So generally an accountant will tell you that your write-off should occur once per year, and it's usually for accounts that have become delinquent and you've made every attempt to try to follow up with that account, and then you write it off. But oftentimes I've been in offices where I find that number is very, very high. And if it's too high, I ask some questions, because what I found in some offices is that some of the people at the front desk will, instead of making a proper credit or debit adjustment to an account like they should, they'll simply write it off and start again. And what they don't realize is that affects the doctor's taxes. And that can also, if they're too high, can also be suspect of maybe some fraudulent activities going on. So it's just an area to watch and keep an eye on, and have a process in place. If somebody needs to make a write-off, the doctor must approve it. So that's a really important thing to remember. Your accounts receivable, it's very important to have an aged accounts receivable. So that is broken down into 30, 60, and 90-day accounts. Notice that over 90 days, I have highlighted that in red, and I'm going to be explaining that in just a few moments as well. And then what the total accounts receivable are. Treatment plans presented, we're going to talk about that as well. It's very important to understand that how many treatment plans have been presented and have a dollar value with that, and then how much has actually been booked. So that really helps for your treatment coordinators, and it helps you to understand how well your treatment coordinator is doing. The budget for sundry supplies. Now, I mentioned earlier that that should be based on the collections. So notice that the total collections for this month are $77,119. The translation of that into 5% is $3,065. Now that is the number. As soon as you put that collections number in there, it will automatically go to tell you how much your budget is. Now, this is kind of a movable object, really, because your sundry supplies, as you know, one month you may have a large order, and the next month you might not have a large order. It's important to track how much you have spent each month. So that way, if you, let's say your budget is $3,065, you only spent $1,603, that means you've got $1,462 that you can apply to your next month's budget. So you can add that on to your next month budget. That way, by the time you have that large order that comes in, you will have an excess in your budget that will cover your large order. So that's essentially what we're going to be looking at this a couple of times tonight, and so we're going to be talking about what all of it means in the first place. So it's very important that you don't just look at your month-end reports. It's important to exercise daily strategies to control your variable expenses, because your fixed expenses are things like your rent and things that you don't have any control over. But your variable expenses you do have control over. So it's important to increase your revenue. In other words, keep your appointment schedule full and productive. Make sure that you have productive appointments in there. Collecting payment at the time of service. I have been in many offices where there's an assumption by the dentist that the money is being collected at the front desk. And oftentimes the people at the front desk, depending on what their training has been, they will try to collect from insurance first, and they'll let the patient leave without paying their co-payment. So it's very important to make sure that you have a solid system in place and that it is being followed. Make sure your recall system is up to date. That's another thing that I find too often lags behind. And then if the patients don't hear from you, they tend to forget that they're due for their continuing care appointments. So it's important to watch that that's up to date. And this is also something that is looked at if somebody is doing evaluation of your practice. Make sure that your treatment plans are followed up with. We're going to talk a little bit about that too, how soon and when you need to follow up with treatment plans, and the fact that constant follow-up is required with treatment plans, because once again, your patients, once they leave your office, they have completely forgotten within 24 hours what the need for treatment is, unless they're in pain. But in most cases, 90% of dental conditions are not necessarily symptomatic. So it's really important that somebody does follow up with that. Decrease your expenses by focusing on your controllable KPIs or key performance indicators like sundries, staff costs, lab fees, etc. So what increases payroll costs? That's one thing that we're going to be talking about tonight. Openings in the schedule, that's fairly obvious, but the overhead, of course, the overhead costs go up because no revenue is being generated during those openings, and yet you are still paying for all of your staff to be there. You're paying for all of the equipment, all of the dental supplies, the heat, the light, etc. So it's important that the schedule is full and productive at all times. Here's another little wastage that you may or may not be aware of, and that is clocking in and clocking out correctly. It may not seem like much, and your employees will certainly say, well, you know, what's 15 minutes? You know, it's not a big deal. But at the beginning and the end of the day, it adds up in per employee. So it's very important that they clock in and clock out correctly. There are some systems there which allow the employees to control their own clocking in and clocking out, but of course it has to be overseen by a manager or a computer system. I know of a couple of computer systems that can certainly help you with that. But that non-productive time can help to increase your payroll costs by anywhere between 5 to 7%. So if you're running at 23 to 24% payroll expenses, and you add in that wastage, that wasted time, then you're looking at very high payroll costs. It's very important to understand what your employees are doing during that downtime activity, and to make sure that they're doing something that is productive for the practice. So I always suggest that hygienists, for example, call their patients, but give them the skills in order to do that. One of the handouts that I provided you with tonight is a hygiene downtime activity, basically. But it also includes how to call the patients, what to say to the patients, how to make those appointments. Remember that your clinical staff are not necessarily trained on administrative skills, because that's why you have an admin team that to do that. However, if you give them the time, tools, training, and technology, they can do that, and they can increase their own productivity and keep their own schedule full. This is a really important point, because I've found in so many offices that I've been in that the hygienists will complain that you know, their hours are being cut, or they don't have enough hours, or one thing or the other. And I'll talk to them about what they're doing during their downtime. And some of them don't like to call patients. And I understand that, you know, once again, they've been clinically trained. But some of them are quite willing to do it, as long as you give them the information and give them a quiet space where they can call their patients. So I suggest especially to hygienists, to call your perio patients, you know, for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that they are following that schedule, because you've set them up on a nice schedule to treat that active disease. But the other thing is to stay in touch with your perio patients, because you are their clinical provider. So just give them the skills to do it, and give them the time to do it. Obviously, if it's downtime, they have the time to do it. So and that way they will fill their own schedule up very, very quickly. And it happens, it goes really well. Are there a lot of no-shows and short notice cancellations in their schedule, or anybody's schedule? And if so, why are they occurring? And what's being done at the front desk to avoid them? So as part of our appointment scheduling webinar that we did, we talked about ways in order to avoid no-shows and short notice cancellations. So that's really important to follow those things. Turn your downtime into productive time. So even if the doctor or the associate doctor has too much downtime, let's say they're just starting out with your practice, then that downtime could turn into treatment planning time. It's really important for that doctor to look at the current treatment plans they have, or look at the patients that they've already seen, and develop those treatment plans. And that's a great mentoring opportunity for the principal owner to help the associate doctor to really understand how treatment planning works. And it's a continuous process. And if you're working with a treatment planner or treatment coordinator, then it works exceptionally well, because then everything can be turned over to the treatment coordinator. He or she can get those appointments booked, and that way you've got a full and productive schedule. So that's a little tip for associate dentists as well. Employees, of course, must be paid for the time that they work, and that's where it's important to remember that. So if they clock in 15 minutes early, basically you have to pay them for that according to labor laws. But you can avoid it by setting their schedule and including time for start of the day, including time for at the end of the day as well. So for example, if you expect an employee to arrive 15 minutes to attend the morning meeting, the employee must be paid for that time. And here's a little something that I would also ask you to clarify. You might want to clarify this in your employment policies manual, but the morning meeting time is working time, and employees are expected to be ready to attend and to participate. They're not to be sitting there eating their breakfast. They're not to be chit-chatting about what they did the night before. I mean, it sounds really strict. You want it to be open and positive, but create that expectation that, you know, they are there for that 15-minute huddle meeting, that they're there to talk about what their schedule is for the day, what expectations of the day should be. And that can turn into a very productive meeting. And most offices that I've dealt with, once they get used to having the morning huddle meeting, then they can't do without it, because it just helps the entire day to run much more efficiently. But everybody should be there ready to participate, not chatting about the day before, and certainly not eating their breakfast. They need to be paying attention and going through the meeting. It's an opportunity to prepare for your day and to plan for patient care. An example that I use is for hospitals, for example. When one shift moves to the next shift, there's always a report time, so that your morning meeting is like your report, your daily report. And so they talk about the patient care from the previous shift. They talk about what the patient needs are for the current shift, and it's the same idea behind the morning huddle. So it's extremely important. Allow time to write up any chart notes that are not written up at the time of treatment. This is something that's very important. I've been in offices where all of the chart notes are left to the end of the day. So the hygienist, which it's really unfortunate because I'm sure that he or she wants to get home to their family as soon as possible, don't write up chart notes at the end of the day. And there are so many errors that can occur, because how can you possibly remember what you did clinically for the very first patient if it's now the end of the day and you're tired and your hands are sore and your wrists are sore? How can you remember that? So it's really important to write up the chart notes at the time that the patient is being seen, at the treatment time. You can use a template. So templates are great things, because all you need to do is fill in the numbers, basically, write up any additional little bit at the end, and make sure it's in the computer system. So you can be doing this as the doctor's doing the recall check, making sure your chart notes are up to date, everything is great. And then of course, listening to the doctor, because the doctor will give the diagnosis and set for the next appointment as well. So also provide time for cleanup and prepare for the next day. Have 15 minutes, allow 15 minutes at the beginning of the day and 15 minutes at the end of the day. And that is usually sufficient time for cleanup and prep work. Now, if you include a morning huddle, then you might want to turn that 15 minutes into 25 minutes or 30 minutes at the beginning of the day. So allowing them 15 minutes to get ready, everything is set, and then you have your 15-minute huddle. The huddle doesn't have to be 15 minutes, it can be 10 minutes, it can be less than that if you're organized and everybody is on time and they're ready to participate at that meeting. So your dental office management systems can break down really quickly, and it's a silent process. You may not, of course, the doctors are busy treating patients, you're busy providing care, and so you may not realize that your management system is breaking down. You might have had a staff turnover lately, so there can be all kinds of reasons for this. So it's a silent process. It quietly eats away at its management systems until breakdown occurs, and often that will create long-term negative effects. So in today's webinar, we're talking about how to uncover inefficiencies in your management systems, but you should also discover opportunities for improvement as well. Complacency is, in my estimation, is one of the biggest problems in offices. It causes actual erosion. So complacency can occur from, well, we've always done it this way. I ask these questions when I'm in an office, why are you doing this a certain way? And it's not to be critical, and I always make sure that I preface it by telling the employee that I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just asking you just so you can explain to me why it is that you're doing it that way, because I don't want to make recommendations to fix a system that isn't broken. If I can improve the efficiency, great. If they're already doing something very efficiently, then I don't touch it. I praise that, and congratulate them on doing a great job in that particular area. So some of the hidden signals that can cause and the causes of the breakdown of systems are basically your practice collections. If your collections aren't, if you're not on top of your collections, then that's a system that can be fixed quite quickly and easily. Your scheduling systems, that again is pretty much a quick fix. I had one accountant who asked me he said to the doctor to ask me as the consultant to just fix one thing. He said, so the doctor, when I went in, he said, okay, my accountant said, you just fix one thing. So what one thing would you fix? And I always answer that question with the schedule. It's always the schedule. It's never anything else. It's always the schedule. Well, I mean, it is other things, but if you can fix the schedule, everything else seems to fall into place much easier. Your hygiene department makes sure that they're billing correctly, they're booking correctly, and so on and so forth. Your production versus expenses, of course, and your personnel. Are you going through personnel? Do you have a personnel system, a human resources system in place? And make sure that your hiring and termination practices are important. So of course that they're in place and they're being followed up with, rather. So number one solution, of course, is control the appointment schedule, which I've already discussed at length or a little bit. It may sound simple, but it takes real commitment and focus and creativity, not just to fill holes, but to create a productive schedule as well. And that we've covered in the appointment scheduling seminar or webinar rather. If you happen to have missed that, I'm sure that that the ladies at DSG will have the handouts. If not, I can certainly send them the handouts. If you want to send them an email, then I'll be happy to provide a handout from the appointment scheduling protocol. Prevent cancellations and no-shows by how the appointment is made in the first place. And complacency really can be a killer. Now, I'm going to talk about this as well because I realize that we're in a pandemic. So, but I hear, these are some of the excuses that I hear about not having a full schedule. Well, everyone's sick. It's that time of year. This is pre-pandemic. However, this is something that is really important right now with the pandemic, which we're going to talk about as well. Everyone's sick. People just don't have the money. That is clearly a prejudgment. So when the prejudgment like that is made, you're already making that decision on behalf of the patient. Their insurance won't cover it, so they don't want the services. That is one of the most dangerous prejudgments that your staff can make. It's very important that you teach your patients to value the services that they're receiving and that they're willing to pay for the services. And that's all a matter of communication. Patients won't come if we don't accept assignment. Well, I'll tell you, I've been in more assignment practices than non-assignment practices, and I can always tell it's an assignment practice before they I even ask the question by their accounts receivable, because their accounts receivable are usually really not great. So control your appointment schedule. Don't let it control you. That's one thing that a highly trained administrative staff member must do. Having effective communication, of course, is the key to your success. Patients need, especially with the pandemic, they need a compelling reason to leave their homes to come for dental treatment, and they need reassurance that the environment is safe. Now, that's the important thing, and that's where your communication skills for when you are scheduling those appointments, when you're confirming the appointments, whether it is by email, text message, or by phone. I recommend all three, and especially the phone now, because your patients need that verbal reassurance of what you're doing in order to make sure that the environment is safe. But not only that, this is a pre-screening opportunity to make sure that they are not having COVID symptoms. It's more important than ever to make that link between oral health and systemic wellness. You know, to maintain their oral health, especially during a pandemic, is extremely important. Reassure your patients about the protocols that you follow to protect everyone. So the challenge, of course, in dentistry is that most dental conditions are asymptomatic. If the patient doesn't feel anything, they don't feel that there's a problem. And of course, seeing is believing. So that's where if you can show them as many visual aids as possible, that's important, like intraoral cameras and that type of thing. Using direct and positive language is extremely important. So, and not asking too many questions, sort of walking the patient through the process. And the process for making appointments and getting your patients to keep the appointments, once again, this is covered in the appointment scheduling webinar, but and in the protocol. So one is preventing it from happening in the first place by the way the appointment is made and the verbiage that is used when the appointment is made in the first place. If the patient intervention stage is where pre-booking and closely following up with unscheduled treatment. Don't let those treatment plans fall between the cracks, because if a patient doesn't hear from you and it's gone over weeks or months, and then you try to call that patient and tell them they still need the care, then they're going to think that you're just doing it for the money. They're not going to believe that they needed the care, because remember, they're asymptomatic, they're not feeling anything, and they haven't heard from you in months. So how important was that treatment? So that's why following up is really, really important. First aid, what to do if a patient tries to short notice cancel, then make it difficult for them to short notice cancel, and make it difficult but not impossible. But try to get them to do whatever you can to get them to keep the appointment. Number two solution is contact your patients. Now, dentistry is a relationship business. I realize that our contacts are mostly through emails and text messaging. However, using the telephone as part of that whole system is extremely important. I realize that text messages and emails are easy, they're efficient, and they're fast if they're done correctly. So in the future, I believe that DSG is going to be putting on a webinar on that, how to use those recall systems appropriately, but also making sure that the telephone is part of that process. If they haven't confirmed by email, then call the patient. And also, emails and text messages are really easy to delete or to forget. I'll look at, for example, I'll look at an email and, oh yeah, I realized that, and I've got to get back to that person, and that email can sit there for days, unfortunately, and I do apologize to those of you who know that I've done that before. I try to stay on top of them, but it's very difficult when you're getting a lot of emails. So you may think that you've answered that, and you haven't. So it's very, very easy to ignore emails and text messages. It's also easier to cancel. It's so easy to cancel. Oh, I'll just send a text message. You know, I've got a tee off time that's interfering with once the golf course is open, which hopefully will be soon. So it's much easier to cancel on emails and text messages. Patients who have outstanding treatment plans, it's important to call them 2 weeks after that predetermination has been sent out. The reason for this is because insurance companies will take 4 weeks to send the answer back to the patient, whether or not it's part of their plan. So they do that deliberately. We're in the age of instant messaging. There is no reason an insurance company can't say instantly what that patient is covered for. But they allow that 4-week time period for the patient to think about it. You know, think about this. You're not having symptoms. You're going to have to spend this money. There's going to be a co-payment coming out of your pocket. Are you really sure that you want to invest in dentistry? So remember, insurance companies rely on that. So if you have a top-notch treatment planner, coordinator who is on top of that patient, and at the time of case presentation says, you know what, I'm going to be calling you in 2 weeks. I realize you may not have heard from your insurance company, but I want to follow up with you and make sure that everything's okay. And if there's anything I do to help speed up the process, that will be great. So it helps keep things at top of mind with the patients, and it also helps them to understand that this treatment is important, that you need to have it done. Call patients who are due for their recare appointments, and call patients who are overdue for the recare appointments. Now, I've been in some offices where they will have a list of who's due this month, and that's great, and that's really important to call those patients or to contact them by text message, email, and calls if necessary. So call them this month, but don't forget their patients you might not have gotten in touch with last month or the month before. Now they're 2 months behind their recare process. So call any patients who have outstanding accounts. You know, if they have an outstanding account, don't just send them an email. Once again, it's easy to ignore. And then I hear from patients, or sorry, from employees too, well, you know what, patients don't answer their phone. And that's absolutely true in many cases, especially if they don't recognize the number. But so if you leave it on their voicemail, unless they've received your email, they've received your text message, and now a voicemail, it's less likely that they're going to be able to ignore that, especially if you repeat the process. So leave an effective message. The effective message would be the same verbal message that you would be leaving. Mrs. Smith, this is Sandy calling from Dr. Jones' office. You are due for your appointment, and I'm calling to schedule that for you now. If I say that verbally, I would do the same thing written as well. So I would put the same message on your email that you would be saying verbally, and text messages as well. Control your staff costs. Once again, staff costs should be anywhere between 20 to 22 to 25% of your gross billings. If they're more than that, then you definitely have openings in the schedule or some inefficiencies or gaps. If there are openings in the schedules, the staff need to start calling patients who either have outstanding treatment or recare appointments that are due. If downtime occurs, deploy effective strategies. For example, hygienists call their perio patients or their regular patients who are overdue for their hygiene appointment. At the beginning of the pandemic, which seems like 10 years ago, but last year, I was suggesting that hygienists call, especially their elderly patients, during that time to stay in touch with them. And that turned out to be very effective, even though our offices here were shut down for a number of weeks. The fact is that those patients then were reassured that they were going to be taken care of. A lot of them were lonely. You know, it really helped to maintain that patient loyalty to the practice. Call on the outstanding treatment plans. Patients are waiting to hear from you because they go about their day-to-day activities. They're not thinking about that predetermination that you sent out. So it's very important that they expect, by the way, that's what your patients expect. They expect you to be following up with it so they don't have to worry about it. Set a quota of how many patients calls should be made per hour. I did this at one particular practice, and it turned out to be really, really, really effective. Where I realized nobody wants to do recare calls all day long, and I get it. It's a bit tedious, not as much fun. But at this particular practice, they were making the recare calls, but they were so mundane. They were just not making effective calls. So what we did was we had a rotation of the admin team, basically. So the admin team would go back to the back for 2 hours and make these number of calls. And each person would have a certain quota of how many calls that they had to make. And we changed the verbiage. And the reason for this was I was asked by the recall coordinator, she said, how many times do I call a patient before I give up? I said, well, you shouldn't give up, but tell me what you're saying when you call. And so on the patient record, I think there were 11 or 12 calls, called, left message on machine, called, left message on machine. And then I asked her what message she was leaving on the machine. This is Teresa calling from such and such dental practice. You're due for your cleaning appointment, so don't call it a cleaning, your cleaning appointment, and I'm calling to schedule that for you. Call me back, or if you want to schedule that. It was so wishy-washy. So using direct language and making sure that the patient really understands the importance of that call, and making a certain number of calls. Well, that practice was booming within a couple of months. It really took 2 hours. So if each person took 2 hours at it, then it's not as tedious, it's not as tiresome, and it was extremely effective. So what do you think about what your team are doing through their downtime? They should be doing chart audits. They have to do chart audits anyway, but why not do them, get ready for the next day, call patients who have any outstanding treatment plans. I always suggest that hygienists call their perio patients because, again, you're the primary provider for your perio patients. Restock your operatories, of course. Help other team members, do some instruments, throw some instruments into the Stericycle and get things ready. Help each other out as much as you possibly can, because if you take the time to do that, then your other hygienists or your other caregivers, employees will help you out as well. I had this happen at the very first practice that I worked at, and where I would sterilize the instruments for the hygiene team. We had 4 hygienists at that practice, and I would take their x-rays, mount the x-rays, get them all set up, everything set up for the practice. And then when the hygienists had downtime, they would come to the front desk and help me. So, it's a win-win situation if you help each other out. That's really, truly what teamwork is. This is a sample of a chart audit. Now, I have included a chart audit with your handouts tonight. So, things, for example, have x-rays been taken? Should they be taken today? Has there been an exam to prescribe x-rays? Has the patient been given appropriate pre-meds if they need pre-meds? Are there any special precautions? Does room require additional setup? And so forth, so on and so forth. So is it a difficult patient? Is it a perio patient? This is a hygiene one. Here's some personal information. Is there something that you should know about the patient? Because it really helps to surprise and delight the patient if you remember something special about them. Do they have outstanding treatment? That's probably one of the most important things that you need to look at when you're doing your chart audit. If you're taking photos, intraoral or extraoral. Here's one for a dental assistant. So the same type of idea. One of the most important things that a dental assistant should be doing with their chart audit is verify that next treatment matches what is scheduled. That's really important. So make sure that treatment plan matches. Make sure the lab cases are there. That's extremely important. I've consulted with a couple of hospitals. One hospital in particular, they were just about to, it was a children's hospital, and they were just about to, the child was going into the OR, and so that child would have been under general anesthetic, and the lab case was not there. So make sure all lab cases are there. And this generally is done by your assistants the day before. Is the next recall scheduled? Why not? The assistant should be doing that as well, making sure that the recall is, that's not just for the hygienist, that's for the assistant as well. Again, personal information, outstanding treatment, and so on and so forth. Here's an example of a hygiene downtime policy, which I realize there's a lot on this screen. I tried to put as much on as I can, but it's included with your handout, so you'll have a printed copy of that. The most important thing here is there's a script for scheduling appointments. And so the hygienist will be shown how to exactly schedule that appointment. So don't say it's a cleaning appointment. And then there's a little grid of, which is a separate page on your handout, the name of the patient, what type of appointment they need, the date and time that you called, the date, was it booked or not booked, and the reason for not booking if it wasn't booked. So those, again, once again, are included with your handouts. Controlling your sundry supplies. As I mentioned earlier, your sundry supplies should be 5% of your billings or collections. Most offices that I deal with like to base it on their collections because you've received the money, you've got the money in your budget. Set a monthly budget for your assistant and provide her or him with the dollar figure. So for example, if you billed $100,000 this month, the sundry budget would be $5,000. The reason I tell them or suggest that you give them a dollar figure was I was at an office one time where I said to the assistant who was ordering the supplies, I said, is there any way you can stay within 5% of your monthly billings? She said, nope, no way, nope. I'm going to order what the doctor wants me to order. And, in other words, your budget can really take a flying leap as far as I'm concerned. But, and she had a really valid point. I was giving her the wrong information. I was saying to her 5%. Well, 5% of what? When I said to her, okay, do you think maybe, I've noticed you're spending this much. Do you think maybe you could stay within $5,000? Again, I got the negative because we'd already started off on probably the wrong note there. But then she said, well, I'll try, but I don't think I can. Well, I tracked that lady over 6 months and she came in at 4%. So what that told me was I gave her the wrong information. I should have said to her, do you think you could have stay within the 5,000? If you don't spend 5,000 this month, you can apply it to the next month. If I had presented it properly, at the time, but I learned from that experience. And so now when I'm talking to assistants about ordering, that's what I will suggest to them, that they have a dollar figure, and that's why that dashboard report will help. Ensure that sundries are being properly allocated. Many times I've gone into offices where instruments are, if handpieces, for example, come into the practice, they'll automatically put them under sundries. Well, instruments are not consumable. They're equipment, and equipment has depreciation value. So it's important that your assistants understand that, and assistants are not expected to be accountants. So your accountant, what the system that I use, that I suggest using, is as the invoices and packing slips are coming in, especially the invoices, that you give your assistant a list of what's considered sundries, what's considered equipment, and right on the invoice, is this equipment or is it sundries? And it makes it really easy for your accountant, as well as then your assistant doesn't have to think about it any longer either. So as supplies are received right on the invoices or packing slips, the expense category that it belongs to. Once again, back to the dashboard report just briefly. So once again, with the total collections of 77,119, as I've already mentioned, this will automatically set your budget for the coming month. And then you take off the amount spent for this month, and then you've got 1462.76 that you can apply to your next month's budget. So having proper inventory control is extremely important as well. I suggest doing a complete inventory once per year. And the reason for that is a lot of times you've got expired items in your stock room. And so it's really important that that's kept up to date and that things are rotated or thrown out if need be. It also helps to prevent from over ordering by knowing what current stock you have in place. Now, I know that your representatives are great and very helpful at helping you to order. One thing I would suggest is that your suppliers are also in the business of selling supplies. So the important thing is, if you know what you need to order and you have a budget in place, then you have everything organized, and that way you can make the appropriate ordering, and your dental supplier will be happy that you've done that as well. So it's a win-win situation. So clinical staff members should be assigned to the responsibility for clinical supplies, and admin staff member responsible for admin supplies. So for paper, for front desk items, for example. Careful monitoring of the usage of each item, along with the implementation of reorder tags if you use that system. I love a barcoding system if you can make barcoding labels, and as your supplies come in, have a barcoding system where you can literally scan that in. I did that something similar at the University of Toronto years ago, where there were like 10,000 charts all over the place, and so we set up a chart room with a scanning system. So you would scan out and you would scan in, and you would know exactly who had that chart and where it was. Now with electronic charts, it's much easier. But you can do something similar, have a scanning system, or just having reorder tags so you know what time you need to reorder, making sure that you have enough time to receive that supply from the supplier, and the order number should be right on the tag. It's kind of an old-fashioned way of doing it, but it does work quite well. Expiry dates, make sure that expiry dates are recorded and that stock is rotated appropriately. So that's really important. Improving your hygiene billings. Remember, if your hygiene billings should be anywhere between 175 to 180 per hour. Now the industry norm is 180 per hour. So it's important to provide appropriate care, of course, and billing accordingly. I never want to have a hygienist think that I'm telling them how to treat, because that's not the case. Yeah, well, all I'm trying to suggest to hygienists is to book the appropriate time that you need for that patient and to bill according to the time that you need. So it's very easy. And if you do it in that way, you'll never go wrong. What I found is that a lot of times that hygienists are maybe hesitant to bill so many time units of scaling, and the scaling unit actually encompasses everything, including patient education, probing, etc. Now I have included a handout with that was written by the CDHO and the ODA, so that's Ontario based. I realize that a lot of people online tonight may not be from Ontario, you may be from another province, or you may be from another country for that matter, from the US as well. But the idea, the concept behind this is exactly the same, that when the hygienist is doing it's not scalar to tooth time, it's total treatment time. And that's why I included that article for you, just to understand what the concept is behind that. So for example, if hygienist has 1 hour for an adult, they should be billing 3 time units of scaling, or at very minimum 2.5 time units of scaling, and then a half unit of polish. Now the thing is with the insurance companies will usually cover a full unit of polish, but I've yet to know a hygienist who does a full unit of polish, because a full unit would be 15 minutes in my area. But polishing usually only takes, 3 to 5 minutes at the very most. So most hygienists are comfortable with billing a half unit, and that's absolutely fine. In the full scaling unit, if the patient goes more than 7.5 minutes into that unit, they can bill for the entire unit. So the article I've included for you, I realize that it's Ontario based, but it will be applicable if you just extract the important information out of that, being that the scaling time does not include just scalar to tooth time. It does, what it doesn't include though, is making next appointment or cleaning the room. But everything else, if you sit the patient up and you're going through oral hygiene instruction or anything that's involved in treatment time, that's included in the scaling unit. That's really the main point that I wanted to make. If there are too many openings in the hygiene schedule and calls are being made, then you may have too many open hygiene hours. And that's something else that you need to look at as well. And I'm going to take you back to the dashboard for just a minute. Decrease the number of available hours. You can always increase them if you get busy, but decrease them now for the efficiency of your practice. Make sure that you calibrate your billings if you have multiple hygienists so that they are billing according to your standards of care. So for example, if they have the hour open, or if they have the hour that they're booked, that is either 3 or 2.5 time units of scaling that they're billing for, and make sure that everybody's doing the same thing. I wanted to point something out here with the hygienists. There's 5 hygienists at this practice, but you'll notice that the hygienist 1 and hygienist 3 are billing much below what the industry norm is. Actually, hygienist 5 is too. And there's a specific reason for that. Look at their downtime units. This one has 27 downtime units, which is 6.75 hours of downtime. And she works 6 days. So 6.75 hours is a lot of downtime. This one has 29 units of downtime and 7.25 downtime hours. So these two hygienists could really be combined. That is 2 full hygiene days that are open, basically. So if you have 5 hygienists, I would definitely cut some hours back there. And once again, you can increase them when you get busy. The hygienist can also participate by helping to contribute by making calls to their patients as well. So there are all kinds of strategies to get those hours up, but that's why this is so important to watch what your downtime hours are. It's really important. Your lab costs, they should be 10% of gross billings. That indicates that the higher end of services are being performed. If they are less than 10%, you could be performing the bread and butter services, which you need to do as well. But larger services, maybe not necessarily being completed. So what I would look at is what treatment planning activities are happening. Is the doctor spending time doing treatment planning? And if so, is the treatment planner involved in that and helping with that process? And the follow-up, to make sure that follow-up is being done in a timely and effective manner. Are you busy doing all the bread and butter services? Then you might want to think about block scheduling, which I covered in past webinar as well. Don't be dependent on insurance company approvals, because the patient still needs the care as well. And a really highly qualified treatment planner will certainly help you with that. Offer more choices and payment options if available, and use a dedicated treatment coordinator, because they really are, they can pay for their own salaries in one treatment plan if it's a major treatment plan. Your accounts receivable is an asset to your practice, but it can also be a liability if it's out of control. So accounts receivable represent services you've already provided. So if the patient hasn't paid you, then that is a huge problem, and your banker will agree with that. Accounts receivable is an asset that loses its value rapidly. And I'm just going to give you an example. In a prior life, I actually worked in a bank doing this exact thing. But your banker will ask you for your accounts receivable. And the reason for that is to find out how much is still outstanding and to really give you a certain amount if you're of borrowing power. So if you need an operating loan for your practice, which most offices do, then the banker will need to see your accounts receivable to see how efficient your accounts receivables are. So for example, in this particular example, we have the total accounts receivable is $100,000, and 30 to 45 days is 25,000. That's fine. 50 to 60 days is 50,000, and 90 days is 25,000. The banker will immediately take off that 25,000 because that's worth zero. Then they will look at these 60-day accounts. Your patients have been in 2 months ago, they've received services and they haven't paid you yet. Even if it's an assignment practice, the insurance company would have reimbursed them by now. So, so there's a 75% risk that those accounts are going to end up in 90 days. So in this assessment, the banker will say that the true value of your asset is really $37,500 because they consider 90-day accounts not collectible. According to, this is for Stats Canada, if you have an actual loss, you will require equal or greater amount of new sales to offset your loss, which means that you need to be able to be attracting new patients and at a rate that is equal to at least or greater than your financial loss. So for example, I said based on $1 million worth of revenue, if you're running at 10% loss due to uncollected accounts, that's $100,000. You need to generate at least $110,000 in new revenue just to offset the loss. And I realize we're going a little bit late, so I'll just skip through this screen. Just here's the bottom line. If you're 90-day accounts, you're already running at 15% loss. No viable business wants to run at a loss. All financial arrangements should be made before treatment is started. The only exception is when you need to relieve discomfort, so emergencies. The privacy of the patient needs to be protected during all financial arrangement discussions, and recognize the nature of the discussions. Call your overdue accounts. If your patient hasn't paid you in 60 days, get on the phone and start calling them now. Patients owe you money and have been allowed to delay payment are also more likely to complain about their treatment. I've experienced this firsthand as well, because they believe by complaining they won't have to pay. Establish an operating budget. So knowing your numbers, which we've talked a lot about tonight, keeping your fingers on the pulse of the practice. Having an operating budget is a starting point, so it helps you to stay on track, just like a normal household budget. If you know how much money you have to spend, then and you know how much money you need to bring in, then it helps to keep you on track. Your computer software will provide you with a lot of numbers that are very helpful, but you may also need to get your profit and loss statement as well. If the numbers are out of alignment with your budget, it helps to make those corrections as quickly as possible to bring them back into alignment. And then also to empower your employees by having employment agreements in place, having your employment policies manual. This is an entirely other webinar. Making sure that you do regular performance reviews at least annually for a number of different reasons. Having staff meetings regularly to make sure that everything is on track is extremely important. Having your daily huddles and making sure that they're not sitting eating breakfast, that you're actually talking about the day and the productivity of the day and that type of thing. Having positive communications to help your team feel good about themselves. The first prosthodontic practice I ever worked in years ago, we used to have our morning huddle. Everybody had to be on time. That was mandatory. And but at the end of it, the doctor would always make sure that everybody kind of lifted each other up. So say something inspirational or tell a joke. So we always started off on a very positive note every day, give each other a high five, go team. And I'm telling you, that was the best experience. I loved working at that office, probably would still be there. Unfortunately, the doctor passed away. fairly young, and it was unfortunate. But happy team members produce results, and that was a really amazing practice to work in. Your case acceptance and treatment planning, if your case acceptance is below 50% or 50%, at 50%, that means that half of your patients don't believe that they need the service. They don't need that, they need the treatment. So it's important to follow up with your treatment plans. Once again, referring to your dashboard report, we have the number presented, sorry, that is blank right now, but how much of that was booked and the total pending and outstanding treatment. Those are important things to watch. Something you also need to watch is sometimes you'll be sending out estimates for extra scaling units or minor services, for example, just to see how much assistance they're getting from their insurance company. Those estimates need to be tracked as well, and how much has been booked from those estimates as well is really important to be aware of as well. Using active verbs as much as you possibly can. I apologize, I'm talking a little bit fast because I realize that we're a little bit over our time here. We're almost at the end, so bear with me for 1 second. This is probably my favorite statement, so rather than go through the other ones, I have provided you with the slides as well as part of your handout tonight. But I love this statement. I can fix your tooth before it breaks, or we can wait until it breaks and fix it. And I thought that was just such a simple, effective statement. Mrs. Smith, you have active decay, you know, so once again, we can fix it before it requires extensive treatment. Remember that sometimes patients can't see or feel things until it affects them on an emotional level. And I do apologize showing pictures of my relatives, but you can see how bone loss will affect the facial profile over a length of time as well. So show them as much visually as you possibly can. That makes a very, very effective case presentation. But this is the most important thing. Follow through with your patients, because remember, it loses importance in the patient's mind. And when patients leave your office, they have the importance of the treatment recommendations have diminished within 24 hours. So if you wait several weeks to contact that patient, they have forgotten all about it. They're not feeling any symptoms, and they say, no, it can wait. Insurance companies depend on that. That's why they take 4 weeks to send you an approval back. In conclusion and in summary, in this webinar tonight, you've learned how to make your team accountable for their time and activities, what you should be tracking and why you should be tracking it, the importance of not losing track of treatment, and the top 9 activities to decrease expenses and increase productivity. And I apologize for the speeded up version at the very end. Okay, so we can open it for questions.
Wow, Sandy, that was amazing. Thank you. My head is spinning. That's great. We have a few questions. The first one is, would the hygiene production per hour industry norms change due to COVID? Example, lower than 180 an hour.
Very slightly. When it's the 180 per hour is the industry norm, but that also, I find in most hygiene practices that it's usually a hygiene appointment is over 200. So it might be very slightly because there is time space now between hygiene appointments. So yeah, I would make certain adjustments, but not too much, because in most cases they can still bill and book appropriately for their time.
Great. Is note taking part of hygiene billing time?
The chart, putting their chart notes? Yes, yeah, but they should be doing that as the doctor is doing the recall check, or when the patient is still in the chair. My hygienist that I see, who happens to be my daughter, but my hygienist, she does her notes. She turns around and does her notes and books my next appointment, you know, by the time before she sets me up. It doesn't take that long if you are used to doing the, if you use a template, or if you're used to using the same verbiage in your chart notes, then I would do it right there and then at the time, because everything is fresh in your mind, and before the patient leaves the operatory.
How do you develop an equipment budget? Instruments, curing lights, handheld scanners, bigger equipment like iTeros or CBCTs?
Okay, so that's a little bit more complex. You have to know what your assets are at right now, and it's a little bit more complex, as I mentioned. So you have to know what value is and at what stage they're depreciated. So when they're off your books, for one thing. The other thing is when your warranties are running out, and whether you've purchased or leased equipment. So that's why I mean it's a very complex question. But that's the first place I would look. I would look at the age of your existing equipment. I would look at when the possible replacements will have to come in, and then set your capital. It's capital planning, really. And then set your budget there. If you know that you've had a chair, for example, that's been repaired 15 times, and you're spending a lot of money on maintenance and repairs for that equipment, then it's time to start your capital planning and decide on replacements. And then you can speak to a banker about whether it's better to purchase outright or better to lease. Because something that only has, let's say, a 5-year value, a good example would be your computer equipment. If your computer equipment is going to be gone in 5 years or redundant in 5 years, then it might be better to lease rather than to purchase. Because there are various options, because on the books, if you're leasing equipment, you can claim 90% of the value of that lease, whereas you purchase, I think it's like 30% the first year, and it goes over some number of years, but the depreciation goes down. So there's a lot of things involved in that. That's a great question, but probably do a whole webinar on just that.
I agree. Do staff costs include payroll?
Absolutely. Yeah, payroll plus the deductions that you're sending to the government as well. So it's the entire thing. Yeah. Bonuses, if you have bonuses as well, that goes under that.
Why use production figures instead of collection figures to determine the percent of costs in the different categories?
Well, collection figures fluctuate more. So it's just easier to use your production figures for that, with the exception of your sundry supplies, because with your sundry supplies, you're using your collections. You've got that, you've already collected the money. But honestly, you could use either. You could use production numbers for that as well. So it's really up to you what you prefer. That's just my preference for using production. And I also want to clarify, that with the collections, the reason that they fluctuate depends on how the money is being collected at the front desk. So if you're absolutely confident that you are collecting, if you're a non-assignment practice and the money is being collected at the time of service, then you can certainly use your collection numbers. Yeah, it's not a problem.
Great. Well, it looks like all the questions we have for this evening, Sandy.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation again. And I'd like to thank you and Joanne Friedman and Jessica Respondak, and thank all of you for attending this evening. We wish you a great evening ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And it's my pleasure to be with you again.
Thanks, Sandy.
Take care.